Good morning, colleagues. We will have to wait for a few more minutes as the Secretariat is fixing the YouTube channel for the live streaming. So just a few more minutes. Colleagues, apologies for the delay. We might still need a few more minutes to get our technical side in order. So apologies for the delay and thank you for your patience. Dear colleagues, apologies for the delay and a very good morning to everyone attending in the room and greetings to those attending via Zoom. I'd also like to apologize for the temperature in the room again. Like yesterday, it's due to energy and cost saving measures. So please feel free to take off your jackets and ties if you feel like it, if you haven't done so already. So I'd like to welcome all of you to the second day of this TBT week. And as you have seen in the annotated draft agenda, we'll proceed today with two thematic sessions. The sessions today will focus on regulatory cooperation in two areas of growing importance to all members. The focus of this morning's session will be on intangible digital products, and it will be moderated by Francis Dorsemain from Canada. And this afternoon's session will focus on cybersecurity, and it will be moderated by Wei Guo Tan from Singapore. And I'd like to recall that members agreed on the topics for these thematic sessions in the context of the 9th triennial review concluded in November 21. Both of the sessions today are conducted in hybrid mode with a possibility to connect virtually on Zoom. And the plan was to make the sessions available and open to public viewing on YouTube, but due to some technical problems, at this point we will record the sessions and stream later. And if we get the YouTube channel to work, then we will start live streaming from that moment on. And also for those who are joining online, I'd like to remind that you can access the interpretation services in English, French, and Spanish by clicking on the globe button on your Zoom screen. So today's sessions are a good opportunity for delegations to share experiences, ask questions, engage with each other in an informal mode. So please make the most of it and participate actively. Now I'd like to hand over to Francis, the moderator for the morning session, and also before we start, big thank you to both moderators for having taken on the responsibility to lead these sessions. So Francis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and congratulations on your recent election to chairperson. Good morning to everyone. Let me begin to also welcome you all on behalf of the Canadian delegation to this thematic session on regulatory cooperation between members on intangible digital products. My name is Francis Dorsemain. I'm a Deputy Director in the Technical Barriers and Regulations Division of the Trade Policy and Negotiations Branch at Global Affairs Canada, and we'll be moderating this panel. As most of the how to give remarks to open panel sessions like this suggest that we start with a joke, I thought it was appropriate to ask our new colleague from ChatGPT to provide me with some suggestions. So if you'll indulge me, here we go. Why did James Bond file a complaint with the WTO TBT committee regarding AI gadgets? Because he discovered that the villains were using sneaky spyware disguised as technical barriers to trade. He needed their license to bite revoked to level the playing field in international espionage. So what I'm really concerned about here is that AI is effectively going to replace me for my really, really interesting dad jokes. As AI has been the topic du jour of late, we will have a number of our panelists focus in on AI as sort of a subset of intangible digital products. However, as some of our panelists will point out, there's much more to discuss around this topic. So intangible digital products, such as software and other digitally encoded products that can be transmitted electronically, are an important and growing part of the modern economy and international trade. The emergence of these products, composed of bits and bytes, reference to the joke earlier, may challenge our concept of what a product is. For example, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum defines the term software as a medical device as software intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that perform these purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. Software as a medical device that is not embedded in a tangible medical device is regulated by Health Canada, Canada's medical device regulator, under technical regulations that are similar to those used for traditional tangible medical devices. Is software as a medical device a product? For instance, let's imagine that a company sells software that processes images to help detect breast cancer. That company provides the software to hospitals by email. In turn, these hospitals run this software on their regular, non-specialized computer system. From a regulatory perspective, is there a difference between this cancer detecting software and an X-ray machine? Is an app that treats dementia by cognitive stimulation that the company that creates it provides to its customers electronically different from a dialysis machine? Another example of a digital product is software a firm sells to its customers they use to prepare their tax return. Historically, this product was sold on a tangible floppy disk. Today, however, customers download the software directly off the internet onto their personal computer, and it never exists in a tangible form. Is this tax preparation software still a product? When these amorphous new products are not related to traditional tangible products, they are spawning the development of novel regulatory measures. These measures are needed to support their development, address risks associated with their deployment, and facilitate international trade. This is being reflected in members' notifications to this committee, and thank you to the Secretariat for some statistics of new regulatory measures. Up to May 31st of this year, there have been 36 general software notifications, 12 notifications of software as a medical device, and 1 AI notification. In addition, regulatory measures applied to AI and software have been raised by members in this committee as specific trade concerns. This thematic session is designed to explore the types of regulatory measures members are creating. For example, a number of members are creating technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures designed to address artificial intelligence. The EU, on the one hand, has chosen a more detailed prescriptive approach, while the UK and Canada are, on the other hand, pursuing a more general principles-based methodology, which will be followed with implementing regulations. Another example is regulatory measures designed to improve the cybersecurity of intangible digital products, which of course we will examine in greater depth in this afternoon's session on cybersecurity. As well, our objective today, is to discuss how regulatory measures affecting intangible digital products can, if improperly constructed, unnecessarily limit trade in intangible digital products. In particular, we hope to shine a light on the impact they can have on the exports of innovative, emerging micro, small, and medium-sized providers of these novel products, which have fewer resources to address any regulatory burden. This session is an opportunity for members to benefit from a range of experts on this topic. On the one hand, we will have the perspective of creators of standards, technical regulations, and conformity assessment procedures, who must balance the need to mitigate the risk and facilitate international trade, while on the other hand, we will hear from providers of intangible digital products who must comply with those regulatory measures in export markets. We hope this will generate a lively and informative session and discussion that members will find useful as our committee grapples with the opportunities and challenges posed by regulatory measures in the space. You and I will have a chance to pose questions after each speaker. Moreover, we have deliberately left time at the end of this session after the presentations to permit our speakers to engage with each other and to respond to our questions. We very much want members to help animate and propel this discussion in ways beneficial to you. By providing us with your questions and comments, we want this session to be relevant and pertinent to each of your individual work and to facilitate the committee's broader deliberations. Now I'll give you a brief explanation of our program, as we've got a very talented group of experts here. We're incredibly privileged to have with us Heidi Lund from the Swedish National Board of Trade. She will provide us with our opening presentation, which I'm certain will frame our discussions and provide us with the perspectives of providers of intangible digital products. This will be followed by presentations by our esteemed guests, Jason Matuso, the General Manager of Corporate Standards at Microsoft, and Humaira Malik, the CEO of Canvas AI. This will round out the exporter's perspective by providing the respective viewpoints of both a multinational and an MSME. Following there, Heitor Montesa Loreda from the EU Commission's DG Trade will provide some thoughts on the regulation of intangible digital products and the applicability of TBT disciplines. He will be followed by two speakers who look at these issues from a regulator's point of view, Rebecca Anselmetti from the UK's Office for Artificial Intelligence, which is part of the UK Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, and will speak about how the UK government is approaching the regulation of AI. And finally, Jesse Rydell from Standards Australia will provide us with the information on the development of standards applicable to intangible digital products with a focus on AI. Following those presentations, as I mentioned, I will moderate a panel discussion and which will have all of our experts who will answer any questions you may have around the creation of these measures and addressing the risks posed by products we're discussing today. I encourage and welcome your questions for the individual speakers and the subsequent panel discussion. Your input is critical to making today's session work. I would also welcome questions from the speakers for the related cybersecurity discussion that will follow if you are in the room right now. Thank you very much. And I will turn the floor to the EU delegation to introduce Heidi Lund.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hereby very gladly pass the floor to Heidi Lund. Heidi is a longstanding expert in matters related to technical barriers to trade, standardization policy, and international regulatory cooperation. In the last few years, she has been focusing her attention on the impact of digital revolution on regulatory matters and trade. She will therefore be very well placed to contribute to today's discussion. Heidi, please go ahead.
There we go.
Super. Madam Chair, Mr. Dorsman, fellow panelists, honored WTO members. I'm really happy to be here today at this important and timely thematic session. My intervention today will actually be based on a study conducted by the National Board of Trade Sweden. The concept for this analysis was actually founded some years ago, actually in 2018, when we made an analysis of the trade effect of cybersecurity regulation. Already then, we could see that digital product regulation presents uncertainties with really reaching the set regulatory objective. We also saw that digital regulation in some cases imply that different policy areas collide, like cybersecurity and trade policy, making digital regulation challenging. So what is this analysis really about? Well, the objective of the analysis is to highlight in which manner the utilization of technologies and innovations such as AI on one hand, and taking account digital vulnerabilities, especially cyber vulnerabilities on the other, affect the properties of industrial goods and how this should be regarded in technical regulation. In other words, the analysis answers the question whether digital innovation changes the way in which we should regulate industrial goods. And why did then a trade policy expertise organization conduct this analysis? Is it an important question for trade policy? Well, if regulations are not adapted to technical innovation, companies will face uncertainty. If different markets regulate in different manners, we risk regulatory fragmentation and, of course, in the end, trade barriers. But why don't just make an analysis of digital trade barriers? Well, that would require that we already have clear regulatory frameworks. And unfortunately, we are not there yet. Many digital frameworks are on a proposal stage. Further, like the analysis will demonstrate, the conditions for digital regulation are different from what we are used to. But what is then so special about products with embedded digital technologies that we dare to question our current regulatory system? Well, in contrast to traditional goods, the properties of digital products change throughout their life cycles. If you remember in the past, our main concern was product safety, and we could start from the foreseeable use of products, but this is not the case anymore. This makes then regulation and standardization more difficult. We can also see that digital products are less tangible than traditional products, which means that product properties are difficult to follow and control, especially for market surveillance agencies. These products cannot just be picked up on the shop shelf or be investigated in factories. Also, as I mentioned, regulation and standards are still under development. So how did we approach these questions? Well, instead of looking at evolving frameworks, we really wanted to understand how AI, machine learning, is used by industry and how industry sees that their innovation is covered by regulation. So we selected 3 sectors that we discussed with different stakeholders to see how they look at the regulatory development. So we used a bottom-up approach instead. As you can well understand, the National Board of Trade is not an expert in certain technologies. And there are many areas related to this that we really needed to look at. So having a reference group was really important. So in addition of interviewing different companies, we also had experts on software development and cybersecurity. But the most important for us was also to have all the Swedish sectoral authorities with us for quality assurance. So what did we conclude? Well, first of all, it's not a surprise. Innovation, digital innovation is boosting trade. It provides fantastic opportunities for companies to present new user cases, new products. It also gives the unique possibility to change product properties all along. However, these challenges are our traditional trade policy frameworks. In this room and in this forum, we are using the TBT agreement as our main guideline. And this framework requires us to follow, as far as possible, international standards and systems for conformity assessment. What was really shocking for us that many companies developing digital innovation don't see always standards as the main regulatory solution because of the fast evolving user cases. And due that we are today in a critical development where resilience is important, we can see that frameworks are developed on national and regional basis in order to address, for example, cybersecurity. We can see that the regulatory landscape has really changed and digital innovation increases regulatory complexity. In the report, we characterized the regulatory landscape like a bowl of spaghetti. By this, we really mean that even for regulatory professionals, like myself, I have been working almost 30 years with this. It's difficult to see where one regulation starts and where the other takes over. Something that we really wanted to highlight is that the purpose of this analysis was not in specific to look at vulnerabilities and risk linked to AI from a regulatory perspective. However, the results of this study confirms that use of digital product intelligence broadens the regulatory concerns for industrial goods. So today, digital regulatory compliance, it's not just about product safety, it's about cybersecurity, resilience, and privacy. What is maybe most noticeable in the context is that the ability to really control and monitor changes in the properties of digital goods has been significantly weakened. I mentioned already in the beginning regulators, but also for companies. In their software, there are many stakeholders that have their fingers in the same software. And the complex delivery chains are really making it difficult to trace what happens with the digital product. Also, it's clear for us that digital innovation and its areas of use are limitless, not related to a specific sector or technology only. And this should be regarded by policymakers. Also, we see that complex supply chains are not sufficiently considered in technical regulation. And this is really important because the ability to build in security from the start, what is called security by design, has weakened. This must be regarded in policymaking. Also, we see that a good, solid definition of AI is not still available. This is understood differently from different sectors and different stakeholders. In the best of worlds, we would have horizontal digital regulations that are aligned with sector-specific one. This is not always the case. One thing that we didn't really look at in detail, but that we still wanted to highlight in our analysis, that there is a risk that regulatory parameters regarding product safety, cybersecurity, personal integrity, and resilience are blurred when risks are defined in regulation of industrial goods. All these regulatory concerns, of course, affect products. However, these are not currently addressed by a multitude of approaches in various regulatory proposals, but not necessarily in a coordinated manner. Of course, we also want to present some policy recommendations. First of all, on our wish list is that decision makers should invest in more mature regulations. This could sound a little bit contradictory when I'm talking about the fast evolving use cases. However, what we want to see is that decision makers really increase their understanding of the technologies used, also analyzing the interrelation of various fields and coordinating themselves. We cannot afford to work in silos when it comes to digital product regulation. Furthermore, we see that there is a need to start thinking about regulatory impact analysis across sectors and issues, especially since large part of digital innovation is really difficult, if not impossible, to control. We see that more focus is needed on the life cycle perspective in regulation, as the characteristics of digital goods change on time. Here we see that there are already regulatory proposals taking in the life cycle perspective. The question if these kind of demands on businesses can really be verified and monitored and controlled by businesses themselves. Also, we say that regulators must find new ways to gain better insight in digital products by improved methods for what we call in the report continuous compliance. This has led to a lot of reactions, and I was asked, does this mean a lot of control by the market surveillance authorities throughout the product life cycle? No, that's not what we say. I mean, the regulatory solutions must be adapted to different user cases and systems. However, we can see that the current regulatory framework doesn't address the concerns and uncertainties that digital products present. So here really new abilities are needed in form of methods for traceability, auditability, and verification. We cannot have regulations that cannot be followed up. And here, of course, there's an urgent need for resources and new skills. I think I stop here, and I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to later to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Maybe I will take moderator's prerogative now and maybe ask a quick follow-up question and then open it up for some more detailed questions for Heidi during the panel discussion. But just to sort of start things off in a hot pursuit from your presentation, what is your opinion on the ways forward when it comes to regulating the regulation of products making use of AI, also often covered by cyber vulnerabilities?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, after doing this work with my colleagues, I really see the necessity to address AI in industrial products. I can see that the issues of traceability, auditability are important. So here I see both that the conformity assessment community, but legal metrology could have a big saying. However, what could the approach be really? It could be a combination of providing international guidance. It could be forbidding AI for certain user cases or develop international convention requirements. This due to the fact that it's really difficult to control digital products, and also the full impacts of digital innovation is not yet known. I think also it's important here to really stress that the risks are quite different from normal non-digital, non-connected consumer goods, where we were before mostly concerned with things exploding, burning up. Here we are talking a lot about societal risks for future generations. So this requires other tools than traditional goods. And here I would really like also to mention that there's an ongoing work in the UNIC Working Party 6, looking at these digital uncertainties and making a white paper addressing policymakers to take action. So I think I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that additional insight. I'd like to move then now to our next sort of speaker, which is Jason Matuso, who's here with Microsoft from the United States. And thank you to the delegation from the United States for recommending him. And he'll present on perspectives on standardization and conformity assessment for digital services through the lens of real world examples. Over to you, Jason.
Thank you. Good morning, and I'd like to thank the chair and moderator for the opportunity to participate. So I run Microsoft's corporate standards group, which means I have people distributed around the world who are engaged in international standardization. And what I'd like to speak with you today is about this difference that Heidi just very well articulated about the nature of digital services. Microsoft's business, it really has become one of building and delivering digital services. And if you make use of something like Microsoft Office, you're using a digital service on a daily basis. But if I look at our cloud services, what's happening behind the scenes, most people don't see these technologies every day. They are really now a factor of production of digital services delivered from other organizations, be they private sector or public sector, to or for very broad use across all sectors. So I thought I would go down the path of providing some fairly basic examples, two particular examples that will help clarify this discussion. Take something like a traditional good, such as a refrigerator. This is a Samsung refrigerator. I grabbed this picture from their website. But what you'll see on this refrigerator is a screen. And that refrigerator may be filled with sensors that are looking at the food that's within that refrigerator. So suddenly you have a traditional good where you would have conformity assessment requirements on it to test for safety in the home. But now that screen may represent applications that are coming from many different providers all at the same time. You might have an application for scheduling your activities for your family. There might be an application in there for automated shopping. But if you really want to get complex, there could be an application that is doing health analysis on the diet of people who are consuming food from that refrigerator. And those applications may come from many different providers and may be offered from different cloud services on the back end. Ultimately, you're really looking at an integrated multi-sectoral solution on what was a traditional good. More importantly, you have the difference that Heidi's presentation a moment ago, I thought also called out quite well, is the difference between a static good, the production of that refrigerator as a manufactured item, as opposed to the dynamic nature of the applications that are going to get updated on a regular basis. And that ultimately it could be that those applications become a business opportunity for small and medium-sized providers from many different countries, all providing a service through to that refrigerator. It could be that this is inherently cross-border in nature. Another example, a very different example. The world of jet engines changed a number of years ago as the concept of delivering jet engine business models that shifted to being about air operating time, where the concept that the manufacturer of the engine would provide the engine at no cost to the airline, because the only time that the airline makes money is when their plane is flying. So therefore, they have a service model that is inherently based on the fact that those engines are loaded with sensors, generating enormous amounts of information that can be applied with both machine learning and then ultimately AI systems for predictive maintenance capabilities, means that the jet maker, the manufacturer, can only bill for time that that airplane is flying, but it becomes a digital service enabled business model. It's a very different approach. But every single actor in the supply chain for that engine, maybe thousands or probably hundreds of companies, certainly, also would like that data, as would the airframe manufacturer, as would the airline, and probably as would the government of a given country may be interested in understanding air pollution or air traffic safety concerns or anything else that might be produced from that or understood from that data. And more importantly, now airlines may be using that data to judge their pilots. And if a pilot's job was eliminated because they were not efficient in use of fuel or hard on the aircraft and landings, for example, then suddenly that data converts from being non-personal industrial data to suddenly being very personal. And inherently, an airplane will take off and land in different jurisdictions. And so it is international by design. Once again, what I'm choosing to highlight here is that all of this is predicated on the idea of digital services underpinning a fundamental change in what was a fairly established goods-based industry. So in either of these examples, you really have an opportunity to see that data that might be generated in and around a device can generate local value. It could also generate opportunities for multinational services offerings, but they are combined. They are not easily separable. The distributed economic opportunity comes from the fact that you're going to suddenly have what was a good that might be the purview of a single entity is suddenly opening up economic opportunity across a very broad spectrum of size and type of organizations. And to my previous point, the underlying platforms, such, for example, as Microsoft's own cloud service, but there are many, many other such services, become enablers of an entire new type of digital service ecosystem. So, to the point of this committee, one of the things that we have found that is a challenge is that the market surveillance and conformity assessment laws, as they stand, tend not to deal with this challenge particularly well. And we are hopeful to see progression of thinking over time. In particular, you can take it to the next level away from the laws and get to the accreditation and certification systems. Some of you may be familiar with the CASCO guidelines, but there is no current CASCO set of guidelines that help the accreditors and certifiers sort out the behaviors necessary to address digital services. There is quite a bit of activity around this topic, and I will note that there is an effort to establish what is known as a joint certification system, where they are taking both physical goods and services ideas and combining them, but that's still in process. And then finally, this idea of the progression of standards and the underlying audit guidance that is capable of that is also evolving over time. And I will note that in ISO IEC work, there's a great deal of attention that has been focused on this to really separate the idea of foundational concepts from control systems and management practices, as well as then writing and learning, having that community learn how to write audit guidance in a way that is meaningful against these digital services requirements. For the sake of time, I do not wish to extend this too much other than to note that each of the elements on the bottom left of the slide remain open questions and real challenges for industry to sort out with their counterparts, both in government and in the accreditation and certification communities. So in closing, I think the point of the picture of the building blocks that we need to build to is to understand that digital services are in fact unique. They are different than both goods and traditional services conversations. They represent enormous economic value on a global scale, but right now are not addressed in a way that makes sense. We do need to promote a coherent certification and labeling system such that we don't have a diversity of actions across the globe from different governments that create conflicting requirements that are impossible to reconcile. And then finally, within the policymaking community, there is real need to do skills building to address these topics. They are not necessarily easily understood if you are coming at them fresh, but I do believe they are tractable problems. They are things that people can address, and we certainly hope to be part of that process. So with that, I'll thank the committee again. Cheers.
And thank you very much, Jason, for that very interesting perspective and for your very tangible yet intangible examples. As we started a little bit late, I think I will sort of move all the questions to the panel discussion just so that we can keep everything running. So I will ask our first panelist who's joining us virtually, Humaira Malik, who is the CEO of Canvas AI, a small, medium-sized enterprise from Canada working in the AI space. And she will be speaking about AI regulations and trade barriers specifically from the perspective of those small size providers. Humaira, I give you the floor.
Thank you and good morning. I'm actually very glad to get an opportunity. Can you all hear me okay? Francis, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, all right. I will also share my screen on my side. So I'm just going to do a little bit test so that I know everybody can see. Can you all also see my screen?
We can see you.
Okay.
And your presentation. Thank you, Humaira.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Great to get an opportunity to participate and also have a voice here amongst all of you guys. You've heard both from my esteemed colleagues, Jason, as well as Heidi, about some of the challenges related to both the digital side and the AI side. And I wanted to actually share a bit of the perspective from the small and medium businesses side, because that's really are the people that are facing the challenges of some of these trade barriers. And specifically with AI, what I would say is the impact of AI regulations on cross-border trade has been multifaceted. The divergent regulatory landscape and compliance complexities have created just a bit more challenges to businesses that are engaged specifically in AI from an international trade perspective. New regulations that come about from a data protection regulations and regulations related to data transfers. When AI is all about that, and it puts further barriers, as well as at times also impedes innovation. This is really where companies like us are also facing the challenges of going through some of the regulatory barriers when it comes to not being necessarily operating in those countries, but just from a data sharing perspective as well. And hence why I wanted to take this opportunity to just walk you through some of the common set of challenges, as well as how from our perspective, we see how we can address this as a group. What are some of the recommendations from a small business perspective? With that, what I would do is I will dive into some of the common set of challenges that we have seen, at least from our perspective. And these are not necessarily all in any order. It's really just highlighting some of the most common things that we see in terms of being able to operate as a global AI company. And things like compliance costs, when it comes to meeting any of the regulatory requirements, when it comes to compliance, these put a further strain on the limited resources that SMEs have. And that is one of the most common causes, which has also prohibited some of the companies from going outside of their regulatory or the regional boundaries where they operate in. One of the most common things I've seen is also the lack of technical expertise. This is a very complex environment to navigate. and we don't necessarily have access to specialized knowledge at all times. There's also difficulty in accessing and understanding regulations across markets. So having that kind of a simplified access. And I think there is obviously a lot of ways to address to it, which I would recommend later, but finding the right set of resources, being able to, that can help you navigate the complexity of these regulations has been a constant challenge. Market barriers. Things like non-tariff barriers, which are disproportionately impacting smaller firms sometimes, create another layer, unnecessary layer at times as well, I would say. And then there's divergent regulatory landscapes. You go from one region to another, you go from one border to the other. There are so many varying approaches to AI regulations that are being developed. We have seen some of that most recently, where some of the generative AI technologies are launched in one region, but not in the other because of those regulatory barriers. Those are not the kind of things that would necessarily promote innovation. And then implications of the data protection regulations as well. When there are restrictions or any kind of data transfers, that does tend to impact anything to do with AI development and market entry as well. And that's something that Heidi highlighted earlier. So with all of those things, what is it that we can do that can allow us to create an inclusive environment for not just the large companies, but also the smaller companies that are operating in this environment? And these are just, again, not in any order, but just some very simplified ways of how we can start to onboard companies like us as well to become part of the conversation, but also start to actually operate more globally. And one of the key things which we have found is if we can somehow operate with some simplicity and some convergence of easier, that makes compliance much easier. So that we can, I know it's not the perfect state, but if we can develop some sort of a harmonized framework of standards, these are today, if you go and explore, you would find 50 plus standard bodies that are creating different kinds of standards and regulations. And it becomes very hard for smaller companies to navigate that. So if there was a harmonized framework for AI standards, which can allow us to have clearer guidelines and practices for AI related compliance, it would definitely smooth out and accelerate the process of entry into for companies like us. The other part, which I think we've talked a lot about how generative AI has been a barrier, I believe this is a net new opportunity of technical assistance and capacity building, where not just asking generative AI like ChatGPT or others for it, but actually having people that have access to that level of information that can become something in the sort of generative AI to support people like us. And this is really a new way of starting to look at how do we start to specialize some of these fields around the use of generative AI. I won't go too much into cost mitigation, but this is based on some of our personal experiences as well. There is definitely cost is a prohibitive factor for smaller companies to operate more globally. So some sort of a support mechanisms that allows companies like us to be able to operate more globally, as well as supporting some of those things through waivers or negotiated fees so that we don't have to go through different compliance across different regions. I've been a big proponent of inclusive participation. So how do we actually allow companies like us to be on the table? And this is a great way for us to have a voice sitting here in Toronto and having a voice while you guys are sitting here in these meetings out in Geneva. Having this kind of a voice for access would be great for companies like us, because this way we can understand and not navigate the complexities after the regulations are actually built, but actually being part of the conversations. So we have a voice as you think about these kind of non-tangible assets, be it any kind of other digital projects, products or AI. I also believe that there could be a lot more collaboration and networking. We need to foster these kind of partnerships. Just like when it comes to IP development, we have created a framework of partnerships and a collaborative approach between academia, between government, between private institutions. I think there is a similar way to look at regulations as well, so that these kind of partners can start to work together. And we should be actually taking leverage what is being done in this collaboration and this network from large companies, and how do we actually take that and benefit the smaller companies as well. And in the end, it's really all about streamlining conformity assessments as well. Because if we can encourage some sort of a streamlined conformity assessment processes that can meet the needs of some of these smaller companies as well, this would actually allow us to just not duplicate a lot of the work that goes in when it comes to, hey, you need to certify AI in this region this way, then you need to go certify AI in a separate region this way. This would actually really streamline that process. And at the end, I think this kind of awareness and education, there is so much misinformation and disinformation that is available today. And I think we all in this room have really this responsibility to make sure that we can develop some sort of an educational and information path for these companies to learn, because there aren't many people like me that are involved in this process. So I think making that sort of information available for people like us is also important, so that we're not necessarily confining ourselves and our businesses in one area or one region. But to me, it's all about creating a global regulatory environment that is inclusive, that is dynamic, that fosters innovation, ensuring safety and security, and sets a common set of framework for cross-border compliance. And at the end is not cross-prohibitive, but actually facilitating economic growth and participation at a global scale for SMEs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Humira, and very interesting. I think you've hit on a number of points that are quite important for the committee, and sort of ending on that transparency and awareness piece, I think is very important. And I think we've had a unique opportunity with the last three speakers to really bring forward that perspective from the private sector, from large multinationals, from MSMEs like you, Humira. So I think that's quite interesting, and I encourage everybody to be taking notes and getting your questions ready, as this is a unique opportunity to put the questions to the people that we are working for. I will move on to our next speaker, and I will again invite the EU delegation to introduce Heitor Montesa Loreda from the EU Commission.
Frankly speaking, I'm just going to let Heitor introduce himself directly.
Okay.
I think it will be a benefit for everyone. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. You can never rely on a partner when you need them. My name is Heitor Montesa. I'm deputy head of the unit in DigiTrade in the European Commission, dealing with TBT and with regulatory cooperation. And I was a former head of digital trade in DigiTrade also. So it brings together two hats, a previous one and a current one, that are very, very much concerned by this presentation. And if I can start, I would also like to thank Francis for the invitation and the chair for the invitation. I'm not going to use any presentation or any digital technology. I was already afraid of my addiction to my smartphone. And thanks to Jason's very powerful presentation, I am afraid of my future addiction to my fridge. So I'm very happy to avoid all kind of exposure to this. And also because my presentation is going to go to the very basics of what we do in the TBT commitment. Maybe too basic, but I think it's important to go to the basics to try to understand complex problems. So we all know that the TBT agreement applies to three specific categories of domestic measures that are regulating product characteristics or related production processes and methods. So this is technical regulations and standards and conformity assessment procedures. And the policy objective of a measure generally is not relevant to assess if it is covered by the TBT agreement. There is only one exception to the rule. This agreement does not cover sanitary or phytosanitary measures, and there are two substance-related scope exclusions. So it does not cover measures on services or measures for the purpose of government procurement. So the only relevant questions to assess whether a measure is covered by the TBT agreement is the measure a technical regulation, a standard, or a conformity assessment procedure? Is a sanitary or phytosanitary measure, or is for the purpose of government procurement? So If the answer to the first question is yes, and then to the other two questions is no, the measure is covered by the TBT agreement. And this is something that applies irrespective of whether the same measure also applies to trading services, for instance, or to public procurement. It will apply to product specifications, and the TBT agreement will cover that measure to that extent, and it will not cover the measure to the extent that it applies to services. If the measure is covered by the TBT agreements, we all know that several obligations kick in. So non-discrimination, avoidance of unnecessary barriers to trade, obligation to use international standards, and all the questions that relate to transparency. If it is not covered by the TBT agreement, it does not mean that the regulators are in a kind of Wild West. What it means is that a different logic, a different WTO agreement would apply. For instance, if the measure is on the supply of services, GATS would apply. And then, for instance, there will be non-discrimination, but you will have the obligation of national treatment, and the obligation of national treatment will apply to sectors committed under the relevant schedule of commitments and under the conditions set up in that schedule. And why I'm bringing here the basics of the TBT agreement? Well, because I think it helps to understand some challenges, but also some specificities of what we are calling digital products. And these are what we should care about under the TBT committee, and the framework of the TBT committee is products in which these digital technologies are part of the product that you can touch, are part of the product of the industrial or any kind of product that you are normally familiarized with at this stage. I'm going to speak about these challenges through a couple of examples, one on cybersecurity and the second one on the regulation of artificial intelligence. And I do not intend to explain how these measures should be framed, but how they are covered by the TBT agreement, even if they are somehow different to the measures typically dealt with by this agreement. And for this, I need to evoke first some examples of typical TBT measures, and we have seen some of them. So we have specifications to make industrial goods safe to operate, machinery, for instance, or about the size or packaging of products, or the content of food stuff. What these have in common is that they normally are exclusively linked to manufacturing or marketing of products, and that if you have to test the quality of the products or compliance with some requirements, you can do it at the time of putting that product into the market. And you can have a test that needs to take into account the weathering of product parts, but normally you can do it at that time. You don't need to do it later, because safety standards normally do not evolve. They remain static. In comparison, these new areas of digital technologies that sometimes they have an impact on product specifications, they very often apply to the supply of services. And what we have seen in the previous presentations, what we have seen actually is many measures that only apply to the supply of services. And they pursue regulatory objectives that traditionally are linked to services. So the need to respect societal values during the commercial operations, the need to adhere to evolving quality standards that may depend on the context, or the need to rely on business cooperation to ensure that requirements will be satisfied through the whole life of the product. And I give you an example. For instance, if you take cybersecurity, cybersecurity depends on the intrinsic security of the infrastructure that you use, of the product, of what you can touch. But if you think, for instance, of a network, it depends also on the ability, on the capacity, and the technical and organizational measures that have been put in place by the network operator. And the total cybersecurity, if you can call it like this, the total cybersecurity balance depends on a combination of both. And you can achieve a high cybersecurity result, a standard, with different combinations of the two. So sometimes you have to take into account how the services operator is acting in the market in order to assess whether a product is going to be safe or not. And for these reasons, there are sometimes, and I think understandably, doubts as to whether measures for cybersecurity purposes or the regulation of artificial intelligence are covered by the TBT agreement. And that's where we have to come back to the basics. Do they concern a technical regulation, a standard conformity assessment procedure? And the answer is often yes. And they are not sanitary or phytosanitary measures, so they are covered by the TBT agreement. And that means that all the rules that we were speaking about before apply, but with some challenges. So I'll take first the example of cybersecurity. And we have already seen how ICT's digitation and connectivity are core features of a growing number of products, and this will only increase with the advent of the Internet of Things. And we have seen like how manufacturers, but also service suppliers, they have been encouraged to put in place high standards of cybersecurity at the time of design of the product. That's what we call security by design. But also to ensure that those standards would be kept through the lifetime of the product. And this requires that ICT products are able to adapt to new cybersecurity risks. In all this, cybersecurity certification plays a very important role. And we already have cybersecurity certification in many products, automated cars, electronic medical devices, industrial automation systems. The obvious risk is that any regulatory divergence on cybersecurity can expand to a large number of products and a growing number of products. And that's why applying the principles of the TBT agreement is extremely important. And how can we apply those principles? Well, we know that cybersecurity schemes should be non-discriminatory and based to the possible extent on international standards. They should also be proportionate. And one way to ensure proportionality is allowing for conformity self-assessment for low-risk products. However, when you have high-risk products, you may need to have more elaborated tests against elaborate cyber attacks. And you may need to consider also the impact of frequent software or firmware updates. So this creates additional potential for regulatory fragmentation and cybersecurity requirements that may diverge in different jurisdictions. We have also seen before, so I'm not going to discuss, but there is a need on cybersecurity schemes to test against the ability of products to incorporate future cybersecurity elements. So this is the ability to receive software and updates. And for that reason, it is particularly important to strive for appropriate international standards. The second example is, I think, more challenging, even more challenging than that of cybersecurity, is the regulation of artificial intelligence. And we have many examples in which we have artificial intelligence already as a component of a product that you can touch. So you have autonomous robots, medical diagnostic systems, self-driving cars, etc. And we have seen that these AI systems may cause harm to overriding public interests, such as health, safety, and fundamental rights. So we come to the examples that I gave. So you have a medical system used in the health sector. Of course, it needs to be very accurate because the stakes are huge. But it is equally important that the AI system does not have a detrimental impact on the rights to human dignity, respect for private and family life, protection of personal data, or rights of minorities. So regulators, they are confronted to a situation in which they may need to make the AI systems comply with some mandatory requirements to ensure that they do not pose unacceptable risks. And we have seen that the TBT agreement obliges us that these requirements are non-discriminatory and proportionate, but they also need to be effective. And this, in some cases, may require to prohibit certain practices to preserve societal values. Just to give you an example, in some countries, you may have a requirement that bans the use of AI systems for real-time biometric identification in public spaces, because in some jurisdictions, this may be considered too intrusive for the rights and freedoms of citizens. But of course, societal values may diverge. And they diverge more than traditional safety standards, and the potential for regulatory fragmentation is higher. But it's not only higher, but it's also inevitable. This is something that we don't want to avoid. Different jurisdictions are entitled to have their own views on societal values, their own views on what kind of balance you have to do in order to protect your fundamental rights. And this explains that in many situations, AI systems, high-risk AI systems, they may need to be subject to a conformity assessment prior to their placing on the market. And this may not suffice. some AI systems may need to undergo new conformity assessments whenever a change may affect its compliance, because these systems are able to learn. So part of the conversation that we need to have is what kind of change to the initial algorithm constitutes a substantial modification requiring a new conformity assessment. To minimize the burden for operators, when you have an AI system incorporated into products that are already covered by legislation, including safety requirements, the compliance with such safety requirements should ideally be assessed as part of the existing conformity assessment and following the same logic, the same rules. So for instance, if you have a safety test on machinery and the machinery incorporates AI systems, the safety of the AI system should be checked at the same time. But we have to be aware that conformity assessments may well go beyond safety, and conformity assessment bodies may not be equipped to test compliance with less traditional requirements. So as an illustration, if you have, for instance, a polygraph or a product that is going to predict the behavior of natural persons, those products already exist and they are already tested for safety. But the test that you make is that you don't have an electroshock when you are using it. And you may need to test whether they discriminate against particular minorities. And this is something that probably conformity assessment bodies that you have now are unable to do. You may require to have access to algorithms by experts that are not the experts that normally do conformity assessment now, that may need to perform assessment. It could be a third party. Regulators may not be aware of the technology, or maybe they may not have the capacity that you need in order to assess whether there is a breach of fundamental right, a breach of societal values. And in addition, and I'm ending, some requirements that are hardly taken into consideration when you practice traditional conformity assessment, they may have a significant role in testing products incorporating AI systems. So this is the case of the quality of data use, the ability to learn, and the possibility to implement effective human oversight. And I think you can see this with the example of a medical device using an AI system for diagnosis. So it's very important that it works now, but it's also important that it can adapt to new techniques or to new research. So the ability to learn from new data is a bit of like a doctor. The doctors, they need to put themselves up to pace. The AI system should be able to do the same. But that's something that we are not testing right now. You may need a new category of conformity assessment bodies that are able to do this. And an additional problem for testing products incorporating AI systems is the opacity of these systems. Certain AI systems are just too complex for natural persons to understand. So it may be needed to have a reinforced degree of transparency that regarding instructions and the possible risks to fundamental rights that go well beyond the documentation needed for other products. So again, the potential for regulatory fragmentation is particularly high. And there is a need to rely to the possible extent on standardization. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the limits of standardization in this area, because standardization will not be able to make up for the divergences in societal values and fundamental rights that are prevalent in each jurisdiction. So in summary, the TBT agreement covers measures that apply to digital technologies, even measures that to a large extent affect the supply of services, provided that they impose technical requirements or set up standards or conformity assessment procedures with regard to products. And the application of the rules and principles of the TBT agreement are important to reduce the risk of regulatory fragmentation. But at the same time, there are features of the regulation and the examples that I gave, cybersecurity and AI systems, that can make more difficult the shared objectives of preventing regulatory divergence. And there are good reasons why this is the case. I stop here and I will be very happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Heitor, for a very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I'll turn the floor now over and the wonders of hybrid meetings to Rebecca Anselmetti, who's joining us from the Office for Artificial Intelligence in the United Kingdom, who will be presenting on UK's AI regulatory approach. Rebecca, are you there? I see you.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Yes, I'll take that you can hear me. I see some nodding in the room. Let me just share my screen quickly. This comes up for you. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it here. Thank you, Rebecca.
Amazing. So first of all, thank you very much for having me here today. And thank you very much, Francis, for the introduction. As Francis mentioned, I'm Rebecca Anselmetti. I'm a senior policy advisor in the Office for Artificial Intelligence, which is part of the UK government, and in particular, part of the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. I focus in particular on the topic of international interoperability and tools for trustworthy AI. So currently thinking about how we can work, for example, with our international partners, both bilaterally, but in multilateral fora as well, to increase convergence where possible of our AI regulation approaches, especially as we move towards the implementation of common AI principles that we have in our frameworks. And that includes also thinking about the role of technical standards, for example, in assurance techniques, which we heard a lot about today. But just to provide some quick background in terms of where our AI regulatory framework comes from. We recognize, of course, that AI has huge potential for society. We see every day some of the amazing breakthroughs that it can deliver in fields like medicine, for example, but we're also very conscious of the emerging risks. And if anyone has seen like the news recently, like coverage seems to be focusing mostly on the emerging risks that some of these technologies raise. But it's very important to also think about how we can balance addressing these key risks that the technology raises, while also make sure that we build an environment that enables innovation to flourish, so we can take advantage also of the positive potential that AI technologies offer. So it was with that objective in mind that we published the National AI Strategy back in September 2021. And one of the core pillars in the National AI Strategy, which was outlining our vision to become and remain a global superpower in science and technology, was on governing AI effectively, not just domestically, but also internationally. And this is because we recognize the need for a global and compatible system of AI governance that, again, is aligned with what other partners are doing across the world to make sure that we also can ensure that the technology keeps developing, we have access to innovation, and also access to trade and markets. We also had two recent frameworks that were published earlier this year, which recognize the key importance of AI as a core technology, again, to develop a competitive advantage. In the science and technology framework, for example, AI was recognized as a key critical technology, and it also recognized the importance of regulation to build that environment to enable innovation to flourish. And then we also published the UK's International Technology Strategy, which really recognized the importance of understanding the cross-border nature of these systems, not just AI, but a digital ecosystem in general, and the importance thereof of collaborating with international partners to make sure that we have this compatible system of AI governance in order to succeed. So just to outline some of the key characteristics of our regulatory framework, this was outlined in the white paper for AI regulation that we published back in March 2023. It was outlining our vision for how do we set out a pro-innovation, but also adaptable approach to AI governance in the UK. So some of the key characteristics of our framework include the fact that we need to account for the positive potential that AI technologies offer. So focusing, for example, on regulating the existing and real risks of AI, while also making sure that we provide, again, clarity, for example, for innovators who are moving across the AI ecosystem, both domestically and internationally, to understand what are the key requirements that apply to AI technologies when it comes to regulation. And I think most importantly here is to note that it's a proportionate and trustworthy approach. So we are looking, for example, at increasing public trust in AI technologies, but recognize that our framework might need to adapt in order for this to happen in practice. So we recognize, of course, that AI technologies are evolving very rapidly, and this is why our framework was designed to be iterative and adaptable at its core. So I'll go into more details about the effective mechanisms that we're using to do this, but basically the intention here is to have something that is flexible, and we can basically understand based on the risks, on the emerging risks that we see in AI and the emerging opportunities, what might be additional interventions, for example, that we might need to take in order to ensure that these systems remain trustworthy, but also that we address key AI risks. And then the final characteristics to also mention is that it's collaborative. So the UK is really emphasizing the importance of working with a wide range of stakeholders across industry, for example, SMEs, regulators, of course, and also international partners to understand how we're approaching AI risks and opportunities, and similarly, what are the current challenges that people are facing when looking at our framework and trying to comply with it. So just to outline some of the key characteristics of our framework, it's a principles-based approach. Hopefully you recognize some of the principles that are on the screen because they're very much based on the OECD principles for AI. They are cross-cutting principles in the sense that we expect these 5 principles to apply across different sectors, but it will rely on specific existing regulators in the UK to interpret these principles within their remit and provide regulatory guidance, for example, on how they apply in specific sectors. I won't go into too much details, but just to name some of them, they are safety, security, and robustness. We also have appropriate transparency and explainability, and again, emphasizing that word of appropriate, because we recognize that there might be some technical limitations in the sense of what can be achieved today for explainability. And we also have a principles for fairness, accountability and governance, and contestability and redress. As I mentioned, our approach currently relies on existing regulators to interpret these principles within their sectors, and we're starting from a non-statutory approach. But as I mentioned before, it's very much an iterative process, so we'll keep monitoring, for example, how effective our framework is in addressing emerging risks and opportunities, and if there are gaps, for example, that we think should be addressed by additional interventions, we'll always leave these cards on the table to intervene further in the future as necessary. We are also setting up a new set of central functions, and these will be the key mechanisms that we'll use for this adaptable and iterative approach that I mentioned. I'll go into more details about the functions themselves over the next slide, but just to mention that, again, this is to build that feedback loop across how the technology is developing, assessing how effective our framework is in addressing emerging risks and opportunities, and then identify potential gaps and future interventions that we might need to implement. Just to mention another few key characteristics is that we define AI based on its core characteristics. So instead of providing a one-off legal definition for artificial intelligence, again, we recognize that what AI means might change pretty much based on the context, for example, of application. So we just recognize what are the key characteristics that distinguish AI systems, for example, from other IT systems, and those are autonomy and adaptivity. And then regulators will again interpret this definition within their sectors and can provide more detailed definition of what AI means within their remit. There's also a key focus on tools for trustworthy AI. So these includes, as I mentioned, assurance techniques and technical standards. And the main purpose there is to make sure that we have practical tools to support the implementation of our principles domestically, but also enable international interoperability and trade. So again, we see them as kind of the common denominator across different emerging AI regulatory approaches. And we think there's a huge opportunity there to ensure that we enable this international interoperability and convergence of frameworks where possible. And then finally, we're also thinking about how we can support innovators in the UK ecosystem. And that includes, for example, the launch of the sandbox that was announced shortly after the publication of the white paper. So just to give a quick overview of some of the key central functions that we're setting up, we will have a monitor and evaluation function, and there will be the main feedback loop process that I mentioned before. So what this function will do is basically evaluate the framework that we have for artificial intelligence against emerging risks and opportunities, and identify, for example, if there are gaps, and recommend to government additional measures, for example, that might need to be taken in order to address these gaps effectively. It will work very closely with the horizon scanning and risk assessment central functions as well. So this will take a look at all the emerging risks and opportunities that we see across the economy, and again, identify how they relate to our framework. As I mentioned, we are also setting up a sandbox. At the moment, we are consulting on the specific scope of the sandbox, but we think that is going to focus on a multi-regulator sandbox. So thinking about use cases of AI, for example, that apply across different sectors, and provide guidance for innovators in the UK on what regulatory requirements might apply to them. And again, make sure that they can get their products to market more quickly and effectively. I think the key one to focus on here is this international interoperability framework. So as part of this function, we will assess, for example, how our UK framework compares to other approaches that have been taken in the EU, for example, or in the US, and where there might be policy opportunities basically to like align where possible. I mentioned before the technical standards, I think, are a common element that we see across these frameworks. So there might be opportunities there for us to collaborate more effectively on aligning in the implementation stage of these regulatory frameworks. And the key thing to mention about the central functions is that even though they will be initially delivered centrally by government, is not that government is doing this all by itself. It's very focused on collaboration. So we'll be working with key stakeholders, as I mentioned in the beginning, across regulators, for example, industry, civil society, but also international partners, to ensure that we have a very comprehensive view of what are the key issues and opportunities that people see when it comes to AI and our regulatory framework. So just to mention the importance of international collaboration here again, the UK is already like very active across multi-stakeholder fora, for example. This includes, you have a few examples on the slides, but it's really much wider than that. So we're working with the Council of Europe, for example, of course, like the recent G7 Hiroshima AI process, very active in the OECD, the Global Partnership on AI, and also in global standards development organizations like ISO and IEC, for example. And the main purpose there is to, again, like make sure that we can work very closely with partners to understand what are the common challenges that we're facing when it comes to AI governance and how we can build this interoperable framework for addressing some of these common challenges. And here we also see a key role for tools for trustworthy AI, as I mentioned before. So the UK government is already supporting the development of technical standards, for example, and assurance techniques to support the implementation of regulatory principles and also international interoperability. A key initiative to mention there is the AI Standards Hub, which was launched last October, together with the Alan Turing Institute, the British Standards Institution, and the National Physical Laboratory. And the scope there is to increase multi-stakeholder inputs, basically, in the development of global technical standards. And it has a domestic focus on the UK, but also there's like a big part of it which is focused on how do we work with partners, for example, like Canada with SEC, or like in the US with NIST, to again identify like opportunities for us to jointly feed into the global development of standards. And just to mention like some of the next steps that we'll be taking in our regulatory approach, we are currently consulting on the proposals that you heard about today. The consultation is open actually just until tomorrow, but this doesn't mean that we'll stop hearing from stakeholders or like engaging with them. So please, if there's any feedback on the regulatory proposals that were set out in the white paper, please send it our way. There are the instructions on the website where we published the white paper on how to feed into the survey, but also like very happy to receive separate contributions as well. We'll then gather all this feedback and analyze it to then publish an implementation roadmap, which will provide more detail about how we will move from the policy proposals that were published in the white paper and towards their implementation based also on stakeholders' feedback. And as part of this process and going forward, we'll keep engaging also for the central functions, but also through bilateral mechanisms with key partners domestically, as I mentioned, like across industry, for example, SMEs and regulators, but most importantly, also internationally, both bilateral engagements and multilateral engagement in key fora that I mentioned before. And the last thing to mention, just to reiterate, like the importance of international collaboration on this, you might have seen the recent announcements by the PM that the UK will host the first global summit focused on AI safety in the autumn. And the main aim here will be to bring together key countries and leaders, for example, but also key researchers, for example, and AI labs to agree on safety measures at the frontier of AI risks. And this is because, again, we recognize that this is a very common challenge that different partners are facing around the world and requires international action. We're, of course, very aware of like existing initiatives that are happening at the OECD, for example, or at the G7. And again, we're really keen to ensure that this is a complementary initiative that builds on top of that to focus on frontier AI risks in particular, instead of duplicating existing work. But I think I spoke a lot, so I'll stop there and pass back to the floor for any questions.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I've seen your presentation before, and I'm learning more and more every time I see it. So thank you very much for that. I'll go to our last speaker who's joining us from the furthest away today, and that's Jessie Riedel from Standards Australia, who will speak to international standards for responsible AI. Jessie, I see you on the screen.
Yes, good morning, and just confirming you can hear me.
Absolutely, we can hear you here in the room.
Perfect, and I just am going to share a presentation. Which I hope you can all see.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Well, good morning, and thank you to the chair and the facilitator for the opportunity to participate today. My name's Jessie Riedel, and I'm the Senior Manager of International Partnerships at Standards Australia. Today, I'm going to speak about the importance of international standards development and adoption in the context of promoting responsible creation and deployment of artificial intelligence. It's, of course, a very topical issue at the moment, with AI being increasingly and rapidly deployed across numerous domains, and with the recent advances of AI models and countless emerging use cases, so much is being said about how to best leverage AI for the public good and how to commercialize AI technology, as well as, of course, the risks associated with doing so. There's a lot of hype, optimism, and confusion, and I think it's safe to say, indeed, there's fear as we don't fully understand the benefits and impacts of AI. So in response to this momentum behind AI deployment, there is also a global race to build the guardrails for AI development and deployment to ensure responsible AI practices are developed in parallel to the rapidly accelerating AI landscape. This race to regulate and the role of standards for emerging AI technologies is the focus of my presentation. And as the intro blurb for the session on the WTO website stated, it said something like the pace, prevalence, and disruptive nature of integrating emerging tech in our lives and the challenges that creates requires novel regulatory solutions to ensure that benefits of the technologies can be harnessed while mitigating the risks. It's my view and the view of many in the international standardization community that consensus-based international standards that are agile and present global best practice must be a central consideration in developing any regulatory interventions for AI. They'll ensure that AI regulation has a harmonized base, and is based on a harmonized launch pad. So they also promote interoperability in approach across jurisdictions. So I'm going to speak about this over this presentation. So skip through that one. So as I've already mentioned, and as we've heard from some of the other speakers, there are a range of efforts internationally aimed at regulatory settings for AI development and deployment in response to the rapidly accelerating AI landscape. A range of economies are considering new regulatory settings and policies for AI that may take numerous forms. There's, of course, the EU AI Act and numerous other similar considerations, as well as several countries looking or having developed AI ethics guidelines or principles and national AI strategies, which all seek to promote development and adoption of AI while addressing concerns. This, of course, is all critically important work, and it's key to remember to recognize that there are international initiatives that are seeking to solve these same challenges, and that it's necessary for the national efforts to be based on international standards and best practice where possible. This is an important point because to facilitate trade and free flow of digital solutions, it's critical that international standards are used as the basis for establishing common approaches. The development of unclear or fragmented regulatory approaches risks blocking the realization of the opportunities presented by responsible AI and risks undermining public trust and confidence in emerging technology. So international standards present agile and fit for purpose solutions to shape responsible design, deployment, and evaluation of new technologies in the digital economy. And importantly for AI, they also promote responsibility, trustworthiness, security, and confidence in emerging systems and technologies. So just quickly, before getting too far into this issue, going right back to basics, I'm going to speak about what international standards are, because terminology can be confusing in this area, and I think it's important to be clear, particularly when it comes to the distinction between an international standard and technical regulation. International standards are voluntary documents that are established by consensus of subject matter experts and approved by a recognized international body that sets out specifications, procedures and guidelines that aim to ensure products, services and systems are safe, consistent and reliable. While they are voluntary, of course, they can be made mandatory when they're referenced in regulation, and they often set out conformity or testing requirements that enable trade, measurement and quality. So why they are important and the strength of them is really in that they are developed by technical experts from business, from government, academia, consumer groups, from interested economies across the world, and therefore they really represent international solutions when they're adopted by business and regulators. And they also promote harmonization in processes, in products, services and systems. And I've already covered quite a bit of this, so I'll just mention to summarize with specifics to emerging tech and AI, consensus-based international standards for AI, such as those developed by organizations like ISO and IEC, are recognized global solutions developed by international experts that support responsible design, deployment and evaluation of new technologies. They are agile solutions that support interoperability and consistency and promote trustworthiness, security and confidence in emerging systems and technologies. And they also provide harmonization across jurisdictions, reducing business costs and facilitating trade. Importantly or critically, they promote regulatory compatibility when they're utilized as the basis for establishing common approaches to regulation or as a means to demonstrate conformance. And that's critical because in recent times, we've seen that there is a growing degree of regulatory divergence across regimes, particularly related to fast-moving emerging technologies that have created new regulatory considerations that are being responded to in a variety of different ways in different markets. And a classic example of that that's discussed often is the 3G and 4G standardization that was addressed nationally and regionally, which led to an issue where service providers and input manufacturers face barriers to entry in certain markets and created a lot of issues. It's thankfully been largely addressed in 5G standard setting and next G as well. So these types of issues really highlight a key concern that I hear from businesses in Australia, particularly SMEs that are looking to go global utilizing or with AI solutions. And that is that standards and regulatory approaches, if they aren't interoperable, the fact is that businesses will face barriers at the border. For digital trade, AI services and solutions to prosper, and for AI solutions to enable benefits across supply chains, it's really vital that policymakers utilize international standards that are developed through a consensus model to ensure that they're fit for purpose globally. So with that all said, what international work has been done? What international standards are available? Under the ISO IEC Joint Technical Committee 1, Subcommittee 42, that is really one of the principal forums for establishing AI international standards. It's made up of 36 participating economies with 20 economies observing the work. Their scope that's set out on this table is really focused on operations and setting AI model standards that outline frameworks and principles to ensure model safety, as well as key AI principles such as trustworthiness, privacy and ethics, and fundamentals like data and ensuring data is appropriately processed and used in AI systems, and governance and risk management. So they've published 17 standards and an additional 30 are in the works. And the ones that they've published include standards on things like vocabulary, concepts and terminology for AI. So those really foundational standards that ensure that when we talk about AI, we mean the same thing, as well as guidance on key issues like big data reference architecture, risk management for AI, trustworthiness, ethical and societal concerns, and computational approaches for AI systems and other things as well. So just one example of the work that they are doing is this standard, which is a framework for artificial intelligence systems using machine learning. It provides a framework for the description of AI systems that use machine learning, establishing a common terminology and common set of concepts for those systems. And it really helps guarantee that AI systems that use machine learning that are created to the standard are created and run in an ethical, open and secure manner, and that they respect the needs and rights of the parties involved. And one application that we've seen for this standard is in healthcare, where AI systems are used to diagnose and treat patients, where the standard is being used and adopted by systems developers to help to ensure that their systems protect patient privacy and security and to guard against medical diagnosis and treatment errors. And now that I've spoken briefly on what's already on the market, just quickly on what's on the horizon, I mentioned that 30 standards are under development by Subcommittee 42, and one key one that I thought I would highlight is the Artificial Intelligence Management Systems Standard, which sets out a framework of good practice for an organization utilizing AI systems or solutions. It's anticipated that this standard will be able to be used in conjunction with management systems for privacy and information security standards to provide a pathway to certification of AI systems in a similar way to other management system standards such as ISO 9001 that's used to certify quality management, or ISO 27001, which relates to cybersecurity management. And there's quite a lot of, I think, excitement's the right word, perhaps, in the standards world, because it's expected that this standard will have a similar impact to ISO 9001 and 27001, which are some of the most in use and most certified to standards internationally. So now moving back to one of the core questions for the panel, which was what opportunities exist for regulatory cooperation and standards development between members and stakeholders in the area of emerging digital technologies. And I've got quite a simple answer, and that is leverage the international work, use international standards to underpin regulation where that makes sense. And I think it's summarized by don't reinvent the wheel. All business stakeholders that I speak to agree that regulatory approaches for AI should be developed and applied in a non-discriminatory manner while taking into account applicable international standards and norms to avoid adding new or unnecessary conflicting rules on top of existing legislation. So as I mentioned, the catalogue of international AI standards is growing with some pivotal publications in the pipeline, and regulators and policymakers should carefully consider how standards can be used and for what purposes. So in addition to that, to pick up on a point that Humera mentioned on having a voice in regulatory setting, I'd also suggest that businesses, regulators and policymakers should also consider how they can have a voice in international standards development through their national standards bodies to ensure that their views and regulatory considerations are taken into account in standards development. And another opportunity is in seeking to engage and use the outcomes of other international and regional initiatives that set guidelines and principles for the development and use of emerging tech. One example of this is the opportunity in APEC, where there's a range of APEC projects currently running that are focused on AI or expanding digital and services trade in the APEC region. Two of them that I'm aware of is one which is supporting a study and workshops on how international standards can support responsible AI development and deployment, and another that is focused on building greater integration in services and digital trade through providing guidance on building strong and effective disciplines on services trade. And then just on my final slide, another opportunity is for regulators, policymakers, and businesses to engage with efforts to uplift standards awareness and adoption. One such effort that Standards Australia is engaged in is a newly established responsible AI network that is a cross ecosystem collaboration between Australia's key government research organisation and a range of AI thought leaders in Australia that has been established to upskill and prepare organisations to support them to adapt to the shifting AI standards and regulatory landscape. Now, while that's got an Australian focus, it also that a key part of the RAIN network is the want to partner internationally. And the work that they're doing is includes providing guidance through workshops and materials to support uptake and adoption of new standards. And while this is an Australian example, I should also say that this isn't unique to Australia, and there are many similar efforts to provide guidance on AI standards, the landscape and which standards are available to support policy responses and to support business. So I guess my last point would be to encourage anyone to reach out and to get involved where they're interested. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jesse, and thank you for joining us from so far away. Much appreciated, as well to the other speakers who've joined us from different time zones. We're very much appreciative of you sharing your insights. I think we've had a very good overview, different perspectives from the private sector, from sort of research and analysis groups, from our government's regulatory side, and from standards organizations here, talking both about challenges and opportunities for trade in these intangible digital products. We've touched a little bit upon sort of some questions around definition and looking at what impacts of these regulatory interventions are, particularly on MSMEs, but also how there's an impact on sort of large multinationals, and contrasted that. And so I think sort of as a group here, now we've got an opportunity to talk about sort of regulatory cooperation. We've got an opportunity to talk about how we avoid the risk that has seemed to gone through all of the different presentations that we've had, about the risks of regulatory fragmentation. So at this point, what I'd like to do is open up the floor for some questions from any members, and please feel free to ask them of any of our panelists. Our colleagues who are joining us on hybrid should be available here. Yes, I'll open it to the floor. I also have some back pocket questions I have after all of those presentations, particularly about this risk of sort of addiction to my fridge, which may be something I have to worry about now. So please, if you want to put in your questions, I believe you can put them in through the Zoom chat. If you are joining from online, or please, members from the floor here. How do I identify who's asking a question? Okay. Devin from the Secretariat.
Thank you. So maybe just to get the ball rolling, a question on my mind is, I'd be very interested to hear the panel's views on the relevance of the TBT6 principles, especially for regulation of AI. We know that, for example, in the G7 context, the 6 principles have been referenced in different documents on digital trade principles. So just maybe that would be an interesting I'd be very interested to hear the panel's views on the role of the six principles in this space for facilitating regulatory cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. Panelists, would somebody like to take that one on first? Aitor or Rebecca, would you like to jump in on that one?
I'm happy to jump in and open this. Thank you very much for your question. I think, yeah, the TBT principles are mostly important when we think, of course, about like how we can improve international interoperability and ensure. So I think how they feature in how we thought about our approach is that, of course, when we refer to technical standards, for example, in AI regulation, how they can support domestic implementation, but also increase international interoperability, we're always talking about international technical standards. So we tend to refer to those developed in ISO and IEC, for example, and or IEEE and other organizations, but standards that can be adopted by different countries around the world. And I think like the main potential for collaboration there is that the you know, like we have like different regulatory frameworks, like they might take different formats, for example, but at the end of the day, we're always trying to achieve like the same objectives in the sense of ensuring, for example, human-centric values are reflected in AI development and deployment. And these objectives we tend to be to see reflected as well in the development of international standards addressing these issues. So the presentation from the colleague from Australia was like really good to like outline, for example, some of the key topics that are being addressed by international technical standards will include things such as bias mitigation, for example, and transparency, and like more the horizontal topic at this stage of AI risk management, for example, and AI quality. So I think there's an opportunity there for different countries to refer to like the same international technical standards, for example, and make sure that like we have like a common set of like principles, for example, and tools to adhere to those in order to increase market access. And the second one that I also wanted to refer is also the principle of openness and making sure that like these systems are inclusive, because we spoke a little about the limitations of technical standards and of course like the fact that they're going to take time to develop, for example, but once we get there, it's very important that they reflect the views of multiple stakeholders. It's not just the view of industry, for example, or like specific companies within industry. So a lot of the thinking that we're doing domestically in the UK, but also with international partners, for example, in the G7, is also thinking about how we can increase that inclusiveness of the process. So how do we make sure that these processes are also available for people across SMEs, for example, to access those who might not have the same, you know, like resources or like time or even like people to send to these processes. And it's with that in mind that we launch initiatives such as the AI Standards Hub to like kind of open up the process, not just domestically, but also to international partners who might be interested in this. And similarly, we also recently published the a portfolio of AI assurance techniques, which outline some use cases of like key assurance techniques such as impact assessments, for example, or audit that have been used by partners internationally to adhere to specific AI principles. And I think it's by building these like common tools of interoperability that we can increase market access and like think about where convergence at the implementation level, at least if it's not like a perfect convergence of like regulatory models, for example, can happen. But I'll stop there.
Thank you. Aitor, do you want to answer? I know Heidi wants to jump in as well.
Maybe just very briefly, because I have very little to add, but I think the most challenging principle to apply here is effectiveness. And that's where I think the dialogues should be very much reinforced, because what do we want to achieve and what kind of measures we want to have in order to achieve that objective is something that may diverge a lot from one jurisdiction to another. And this is, I think this is an area where regulatory dialogue would be extremely important. How do we want to, I mean, in some areas we will, there's nothing to do. We just have different views and those different views will stay there. So there's no way to find a common ground on those areas. But in many situations, there is a lot that we can discuss in order to find that common ground, to see that we actually share objectives and that we are approaching that objective from a different point of view, and that you can have effective responses to that objective that you can coordinate in advance.
Thank you. Edie, you wanted to jump in on that? And Jason after?
Very shortly. I would like to join also to what Rebecca said. I mean, in general, I mean, we need in these times where everything we are looking for, we are worried, we are looking for answers how to address these huge digital challenges. It's really good that we have principles to stand on and we can continue to use. And here I think that the words of collaboration and transparency are really important, and we should not forget that in our efforts. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think that was something that came from other speakers from the private sector. So I'll pass to Jason.
So thank you. I also want to recognize that there is a diversity of standardization underway, and we certainly greatly endorse what's happening at ISO/IEC, but recognize that there are going to be a number of different efforts. And I want to underscore then the importance of the concept of coherence, and that the fact is that one of the methods that we'll get there is to not try and standardize ethics. That in fact, recognizing the diversity of ethics across the world are one thing, but the underlying practices and engineering mechanisms, management systems that can be articulated, such as via the ISO/IEC standards that are being worked on currently, are a way to establish a set of coherent concepts that then can be applied in any market with the ethical overview and the legal structures that might exist within those countries. And so I would really emphasize an importance of this concept of the coherence, and to recognize that I think there is a path forward where we can have internationalized, harmonized approaches that are coherent with the different ethical and legal structures around the world. Thanks.
Thank you. And I see the UK.
Sure, thank you. I would like first to thank all the presenters. We found their presentations really interesting and really like to see the recurring themes of collaboration, international standards, and adaptability and flexibility. I guess a question I had for everyone really is thinking about the current state of play and the fact that regulations and international standards take a long time to be developed. What could be interim solutions, and how quick do you think the current systems can adapt to the sort of agile pace at which technology develops? Thank you.
Jason.
Sorry, don't mean to be overwhelming the conversation. I think it's a wonderful question. I think one of the things that we've often heard is that, well, standards are so slow, but standards move quicker than law, but innovation moves quicker than standards. And so how do you deal with that set of relationships? I will point out that the work at ISO/IEC SC42 began 4 years ago, and that ultimately you have now a significant number of documents that are already completed. But then more importantly, the management system, which is coming, I think is going to be that critical next step, and that's due to be published in the fall. It will still take time for a certification regime to be built around that. It won't happen overnight. I think that one of the dynamics is in having as open a view to having interim steps as well as long-term steps, and being comfortable with the fact that that's going to have to evolve over time. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Just a reminder, I encourage people to members to submit questions online. So maybe I'll jump on that one, not seeing anybody from inside the room. So I think since definition seems to be a fundamental departing point to address regulatory fragmentation, I'm wondering what panelists thinks can be done. We've talked about sort of ISO having a definition. Can we have a global sort of single approach for an AI definition? Do you think that this is feasible?
Well, that's a good question. I hope I could have an answer. I think that much of the digital innovation is difficult to put in one box, and something what when I listen to the discussion here, I mean, we feel at ease when we can put our let's say regulatory framework in different boxes: products, services, we define this. What brought me in thinking, doing also this study, was that we cannot maybe use the same boxes anymore, and we need this overreaching collaboration. So what I hear many times when I discuss the innovation with companies, it depends, and you have to look really where AI is used. So it would be fantastic to have one definition, one model, but I think that might be possible. We can, however, have international guidance.
So I'll just point out that one of the first steps in any standardization exercise is terminology. It's one of the foundational pieces that always gets done. And there certainly was quite a bit of work around the principles. There are probably dozens of different principles documents out there. The OECD's document was one of the most influential, but certainly not the only one out there. And there was a definitional effort there. But ISO IEC, if you would care for the number, is I believe it is ISO IEC 22989 is a standard that is about terminology and reference and it is concepts and terminology. But the point is that is referenceable by any regulatory effort, and it is something that 104 countries did in fact vote on. So the experts from the countries were working in collaboration to attempt to get to a harmonized definition.
Francis, I don't know if you can hear us online here. I think we're raising hands, but I don't think you can see us. So I'll just make a quick comment to your question. I think the need, there's definitely a need to reach a consensus for the definition for AI, because we're dealing, and specifically talking about AI, is because it would be, the global definition would at least help us to ensure that AI is used in a responsible and ethical way. I think that's the biggest concern we're dealing with. But I also think there needs to be some flexibility, because the regulations usually don't imply that kind of flexibility. So we need to look at maybe some sort of a regulatory sandbox approach, so that we can look at how we can accommodate the different ways AI is being used around the world, and then the different levels of technological development that's happening, and how do you at different levels start to implement certain kinds of regulations. Once agreeing on the definitions, and then how do you start to apply certain kind of regulations? I think that is what is required for us to take that kind of a flexible approach, and that's why I called it the sandbox regulatory approach. I think that's how I would think about it.
Thank you. That's very interesting, Humira. I see, Rebecca, you've got your hand up. And also, Humira, thank you for reminding me to look at the screen to see if your hands are up. Rebecca?
Thank you very much, Francis. And at this point, it's just to echo really what has been said by colleagues just now. But I think one thing to mention is that to agree with what Jason just said, there is an increasing movement I see towards convergence, at least on AI definitions. So, and just to cite the OECD work that has been done recently on updating the definition, for example, but also make sure that it aligns with the definition that has been used, for example, in the NIST AI risk management framework in the US, which is also based on the definitions that are being used in technical standards, for example, and it's also aligned with the definition that is being used in the most recent draft of the EU AI Act, for example. So I think we're seeing a movement for these definitions to align at the global level. I think the challenge that we recognize on our side, for example, and that's why we decided to use the definition based on the two characteristics of AI rather than have a one-off definition, is that of course it will be challenging to update the definition as the technology develops. It's really hard to come up with a definition initially that is at the same time narrow and general enough to take into account basically the future developments that the technology might take, and also ensure that it doesn't capture things that are not necessarily AI. And I think that is why processes such as the OECD that bring together different partners to discuss these things are so important. But I think we still need to recognize the challenge that even if we have a definition, it doesn't mean that there will be it. I think the main nut to crack basically is to understand how we can have a process in place to update these definitions in a flexible enough way in order to keep up to date with how the technology develops, especially as this definition starts being integrated into legislative processes, for example, because that is effectively moving slower, for example, in the technology, and might hinder innovation if there's uncertainty because the definitions are being updated, for example, and people don't know what the regulation apply to. But I'll just stop there and just basically to mention like the importance of the international work in this space.
Many thanks, Rebecca. I think the United States, please.
Thank you. And this question is for Canada, UK. You know, the EU has notified its EU AI Act, and I think from our perspective, that was really helpful in the sense that we got you know, an ability to provide a good notice, a good comment on what was notified. In the framework setting that Canada and UK have, is there any consideration of notifying the TBT committee of information if it's not a technical regulation, just given the interest of the committee in the subject? Thank you.
Maybe I'll turn to Rebecca first.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Just my laptop was having a little breakdown.
Sure. My question, well, I made a statement. I said the EU notified the AI Act, and I know several of us as members commented through the WTO TBT notification process, and that was really helpful in our minds to be able to see what the EU was doing in the framework setting that the UK and Canada have. Has there been any consideration of making a notification to the TBT committee? I know that you might not have a regulation, but it might be something that you could consider to notify as a other if you're not having a formal technical regulation, but for information, since this is such an important topic to the committee.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that's one that I'll probably need to take offline. But in general, like just as part, we're again like starting with an iterative approach, as I mentioned. So at the moment, we don't have like legislation, for example, like specific to AI, but instead we have like these principles that regulators will implement to complement existing regulation law and clarify how AI principles apply in the remit, for example. We said at the beginning that depending on how the technology evolves, for example, and evidence that we gather through the horizon scanning functions, for example, and working together with stakeholders, there might be future interventions that we might need to consider in order to address AI risks effectively. So I think it will depend, like what we do will depend on like where we get to in that stage. At the moment, we're still like iterating and like considering if anything else is needed, like how effective the approach is currently being, and again, prioritizing international actions for common challenges that we see through initiatives such as the summit. But yes, I'll take that offline, and I just need to, it's not really my policy area, so I'll need to like talk with a few colleagues who are closer to that process.
And I guess I mean, maybe I should turn to the Canadian delegation instead of me as moderator, but I don't know what your preference. I can answer Francis, or you can have Francis answer. We're very uniform in our names. It works.
Francis, you can answer.
Merci bien. I mean, similarly, we're putting in place a broad framework for requirements governing artificial intelligence. And that the intention there is that would allow for consultation with stakeholders, including other jurisdictions. Following those consultations, then we'll start putting into regulatory measures outlining the types of AI systems that would be regulated and the requirements these systems would need to meet. And so those regulatory measures would be where we would be intending to notify.
Thank you both for your answers. Thank you.
I saw a hand up from ISO.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful presentations, and good to see you, Jesse. So my question was here more about a point that most of you raised, the need for capacity building. I wanted to ask you if you could explain a bit more in terms of what kind of capacity building would be helpful to ensure regulatory cooperation and convergence. Thank you.
Maybe, can I put that to Humera? Would you be interested in responding to that?
Sure.
Capacity building?
So the capacity building is about actually a few different areas. One is capacity building around taking it beyond a small group of people and raising awareness about the different kind of regulations around the AI side. So how do we have enough of an outreach so more and more of companies like us and others can have an understanding? And so what kind of capacity can be provided there? The other part of capacity building is around the technical expertise. How can the regulatory side can help so that more and more people can understand the risks and benefits of AI technologies? And so this is really where technical expertise is required. I also believe that there is an ethical expertise required around capacity building so that those kind of expertise can help people guide, provide a framework around what do we mean when we talk about ethical framework. Legal expertise is required, policy expertise is required. So I think there is capacity building around different areas, which is required in order to make people aware and then being able to implement these kind of regulations. That's how I was thinking about some of the capacity building.
Thank you, Humira. And I think this relates well back to sort of what the original question where we were talking about the principles. As development, I mentioned, is one of the principles. We've had a very sort of developed sort of country perspective here. And so it would be interesting to hear from members from the developing world and sort of feeding into the Secretariat in terms of what steps we can take as a global members and to sort of address that area as well. I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that. I don't see any hands up. Maybe I'll leave it as a statement.
Yes, thank you. I'll take the opportunity of the silence to jump in and like to make a comment and maybe pose a question related to my comment. There was the importance of transparency was mentioned and also the difficulties of maybe SMEs accessing relevant information. And this may also apply to developing countries who want to follow the evolving regulatory framework, but don't know how. And yesterday was sort of a longer day on transparency for the TBT delegates, but maybe especially for those who are not fully involved in those discussions. I'd just like to remind you of the Secretariat service called EPING, where you can actually, to the extent that members notify, also using member EPING, any interested entity, a government official or a private sector person can register and receive alerts as these notifications come in, and they come in usually with a comment period, so time is of the essence. So I'd just like to encourage those who may want to follow further this area, regulatory developments in this area and upcoming notifications to go ahead and register on EPING. And for those who are in the private sector, then they can liaise with also their relevant officials to take any issues forward. But just wanted to take opportunity to make reference to that website.
Many thanks. And actually, that does remind me a comment from yesterday from the EPING session. And in response to your question, Jennifer, we could consider notifying as other, but we'd have to take that conversation offline. So maybe I'll jump in with another question that I have, and this is because you touched on this, Heitor, because digital regulation entail non-typical risks, and other speakers have talked to this in terms of privacy, morality, societal values, and that are inherently less prone to harmonization. And very much more prone to sort of specific country and regions potentially. So this creates a higher chance of fragmentation. So as the TPT committee, what are things that we can nonetheless sort of do as a committee? So like examples for more transparency, more committee debates, exchange of experience, more speaking to a private sector, voluntary guidance, just to frame it a little bit?
Thanks a lot. And so maybe before answering you, just to notice that in some areas, if you take the area of services, we have global operators on searchers, cloud computing, platforms in general, advertising, and national regulations, domestic regulations are completely different. So the fact that there is fragmentation in regulatory approaches does not necessarily mean that there is not going to be integrated operations with presence of SMEs, it makes it more difficult, of course. I mean, regulatory divergence makes it more difficult, and particularly to small and medium enterprises. That is true. But we have already the example of many areas that are not subject to the TBT agreement at all, and where you have different levels of commitments in the GATS. In some cases, you have no commitments at all in many countries, and still you have all these activities that are made in those countries. And in some areas, you have very strict, very strong commitments, but you still have important regulatory divergences. So what is new here is that this fragmented world comes through the digital technologies into products that before this digital revolution were not subject to this risk of regulatory fragmentation. That is what is new. And in order to address that, I think the most important is to first to exhaust what we already have, and it's very challenging and it inspires a lot to hear about the possible ways to improve standardization, etc. But we already have here in the WTO an instrument that can be quite powerful, which is the TBT notification system, and it's very nice to hear about EPING, because it's something that could be used more. I think it's very important first to really encourage, but more than encourage, to remind that there is an obligation to notify all kind of regulations that impose regulatory requirements in this respect. And that's something that should be done in good time, and that should give rise to the specific consultations that are needed to prevent, to the extent possible, the regulatory divergence that is going to make business more difficult. So I think it is very important to make the best use of what we already have, of the TBT committee, to notify everything, to give appropriate time for consultation, and then maybe to bring here to the TBT committee to not only experts in TBT measures, but also sectorial experts. This is going to be more and more needed, because we have little time in order to solve problems before they apply to the market. And you may need to have experts in that respect. So it might be needed to get used to have, for this kind of regulatory measures, to have not only trade experts, but also regulatory experts. And also to involve upfront civil society in our jurisdictions, because some of the answers that you have to give, I mean, to assess whether it is possible to avoid regulatory divergence, you may need to have the views of your civil society before, because there are certain things that, as I said before, you don't want to avoid, because it's a legitimate concern that your jurisdiction has. And for that, you have to integrate upfront the views of the civil society.
Jason?
Yeah, no, thank you. Maybe, yeah, take the opportunity of being here on the podium with your indulgence to make a question, because I think Jason's, your example on turbines was quite interesting. I was just thinking, and then perhaps linking with Heitor's point on data and non-typical regulated aspects of these new digital products, that maybe in the old times you would have a turbine producing pollution that will be released by the turbine and being regulated. And now you have a turbine producing data that you want to regulate, that is leaving the turbine as well, and then you want to regulate. So my question is this the data dilemma or challenge that you mentioned, that sometimes it can have an impact on data flows, which is normally a services topic, but now in this case, maybe linked to the product?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that data regulation is not new, and problems related to data fragmentation, I mean, regulatory fragmentation on data are not new. And still we have a data economy across the world that functions with its problems, etc., but that functions. So data regulation would also apply to machines that are connected to the internet. That is, I mean, you cannot have your data regulation and not apply this to machines that are collecting the data. So that is not possible. But you have to look at that when this, if you take the example of artificial intelligence, for instance, embedded in products, you will need to apply the principles of the TBT agreement. So there are certain things that you will need to do that maybe you are not looking at now. I'm not completely sure that the result will be different. So maybe the example of the turbine is I find difficult to see how, for instance, if you think about conformity assessment, how the conformity assessment on the machine will depend on your data regulation. But the sending of the data, which is not about the product itself, is about how you are going to collect information that has nothing to do with the product. I mean, the product has some functionalities that are important in order to collect data, in order to sell data, but the rules that apply to the sending of data or the collection of data, those rules will continue to apply the way they are applying now when you are using a purely service related technologies, like if you are collecting your data in a platform or through online advertising or in cloud computing. So there should be no difference in treatment of the same reality, just because what what makes the collection of data available is no longer a service, is a product.
So I'll put to you, Jason, data as a product.
So I want to thank you. It's a fascinating conversation. I want to step back. I believe it was a question from the United Kingdom from the floor about time comes back to this, and timing and the speed of things. And to Aitor's comment a moment ago, I think one of the challenges that we see is that as governments are trying to move faster, they're turning towards non-traditional standardization mechanisms. They're still multi-stakeholder groups. Sometimes they're called codes of conduct. Sometimes they're called just, I believe in Europe, there's a concept of the common specification, but there are other domains where they're moving to finding multi-stakeholder avenues to address these concerns at a higher rate of speed than maybe they perceive what the standardization system might provide, even within their own domestic system. And I think that even within those, the TBT, the remit of the 6 principles and of what the TBT is meant to protect should equally be applied, because the danger therein is the loss of the due process, the loss of the protection of the minority voice, the loss of protection against pro-competitive or competition law concerns. As people attempt to move faster, they tend to resist those strictures that are based upon the principles established under the TBT, and that presents a real challenge, because ultimately you end up with potentially some aberrant outcomes that can be really problematic for both small and large players alike. To the data flows conversation a moment ago, I guess the challenge that we see is that the reason I chose the jet engine or the refrigerator example is that those present scenarios where you have entirely new business models that are dependent upon the data being generated. So you still have the physical product, but if you establish that there might be entirely new industries that form around the service that is now being put forward. So for example, predictive maintenance AI systems that get sold into the aeronautical industry would suddenly be only possible based upon that data being available. And so that you have this inherent difference between what was traditional physical good suddenly creates an environment wherein you have entirely new business models. And as we go to seek, and my company has been very vocal on the idea that there needs to be regulation of these digital services and of digital technologies. We recognize the societal importance of what's being discussed. But please recognize that you're dealing with something that is inherently new and different than the environment that you've had before, where the TBT structures or the GATS agreement are based on certain concepts that were established at a time when these models didn't exist. And so now we have something new, and please modernize that approach relative to the newness of what's at play. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason. I fully agree that there is a new area of services and products that are generated by new technologies. But I'm not that sure that this is something completely new. If you take the example of the engine, that data economy is something that already exists, for instance, on online platforms. You have many online platforms that they are selling a service, and they are collecting data, and they are creating new services, new products, if you call them. So this is not new. This is something that already has been in place for at least, I don't know, 20 years or something like that. And what we cannot expect is that the legislation that has been adopted in order to address some challenges that these new, in this case, services pose to the society will not apply just because the data have been collected through products and not through services. The principles of the TBT agreement, the rules of the TBT agreement need to apply. And I think there is something very important, because we are looking at concepts that are relatively sophisticated, and we are trying to we are thinking about preventing ways to deal with legitimate regulatory concerns. But the scope for non-legitimate regulatory purposes is huge. And that is something that is maybe simpler, easier to address, and that the TBT committee is well placed to try to prevent. Because the potential for using regulatory measures in order to just impose purely protectionist requirements is huge. I mean, if you just impose something in your cybersecurity law that creates a huge disadvantage for foreign companies, and it does not serve any regulatory purpose that is legitimate, you are actually imposing a regulatory barrier that has the potential to extend across the whole economy. So that's why I think the transparency function of the WTO plays a fundamental role. We should have, I think, an inter pares push for an obligation for everyone to notify measures that can impose this kind of requirements, and have enough time in order to discuss them, to identify issues that are not truly regulatory concerns, and to try to address them before they create problems that would be very difficult to solve in the future.
I'll pass the floor to Humira to close off this question.
I'll keep it very short. I will agree with what Jason was saying earlier. I think we're dealing with something this is more of a nuance than something that we have dealt with before. And what we're really dealing with is not just data around data privacy now, because we're still at this level, we're talking about data privacy and regulations around this, but things are moving forward so fast, where now we're talking about who would own the IP from the works of that data at the end of the day. And that's really not even my own data, right? When I'm dealing with another layer of AI, which is generative AI, and new content is being generated just on the basis of the information I'm providing, now we're talking about IP for AI specifically as a specific category as well. So I think we are not dealing with what we have dealt with before. We're dealing with something which is creating a whole new industry, a whole new economy. And I think that's what we got to as regulators, anybody sitting here who are actually going to look at what the future would look like. This is a new economy we're going to deal with. So it's not just about regulating and making sure that everything is safe and ethical. It's about the nuance of how this kind of an approach now with what is happening in AI is creating a whole other way of doing business, where it's not just about no more boundaries are there for anything. So we would actually see a lot more IP infringement that's coming up, and hence why they're talking about creating an IP for AI as a specific category. That's what I wanted to bring up, because I think this is not something that we have dealt with before.
Very, very, very interesting in terms of new models, new issues that are raising and things that are evolving. I know sort of a good example I was given was sort of moving from the horse and cart to the car. We still define the power of the car in horsepower. So we're also looking at brand new language as well. So something to think about. I see the United States up. And I did promise at the outset to allow our panelists to ask questions to each other. So I'm going to give a last call to the floor. First to the United States. This is the last chance, and then I'm going to let everybody go early once we've had a chance to hear from questions from the panelists.
Thank you. This is Jonathan McHale from the Computer and Communication Industry Association. Question for the EU and keying off the interesting jet engine issue. So jet engine, clearly a product. A rule affecting whether that product can move data either from the engine to the ground does open up this new area. One of the new measures that the EU is considering is the Data Act, I believe it's called, moving away from just regulation of personal information to non-personal information. So under the Data Act, from what I understand, there will be a requirement that potentially restricts a company using a product from moving data outside of the EU. That certainly is a characteristic of the product. The product will have that functionality disabled in certain cases. So the question for the EU is would a measure, a instrument like the Data Act be notifiable? Should it be notified under the TBT? Because it does impose a restriction, certainly on. I don't think there's any ambiguity on a product and how the product is being used. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I don't know whether the you was me or I guess yes. I think we have to, I think it's a good example of what we have to distinguish here. Because one issue is what the product does, how the product needs to be tested, what the specifications related to data transfers this has. Is it cybersecure enough? Is it, for instance, in the union, you have the GDPR and you will have the Data Act. And of course, that regulation needs to be respected. The product in itself cannot breach the GDPR because the product doesn't do anything. The product just gives you the possibility to transfer data. How the data are transferred, this is something that has nothing to do with the product itself. It needs to do with the business model of the company. It has something to do with the business model of a service supplier that is relying on the company. It is not about the specification of the product. If you are asking how the product needs to have some cybersecurity requirements, that need to be high so that the data that are produced cannot be hacked, for instance, or cannot be accessed by anyone. That is something that relates to the specifications of the product. If it is about the product should not be able to steal data or to process data in secret, because that would be in breach of, I don't know, the GDPR or whatever, that is a specification of the product. But whether the company that owns the product, whether this company can transfer the data or not, that has nothing to do with the specifications of the product. This is a legislation that applies to the company, does not apply to the product. And it may change depending on different situations. It may change depending on, in the Data Act, I don't know whether you are familiar with its content. The European Union is not reproducing what it has done in the GDPR. So this is not about a system that prevents the transfer of data to third countries and only allows this under certain circumstances. What it does is it creates a number of obligations for companies that are using data, that are collecting data, that are transferring data to other companies as a business, as part of a business. It does that. And it also creates certain protections against, to put it in a simple way, against the violation of the confidentiality of the data or the access of data that are protected by law. So just to give you the example of this product, if this product is, you put the product in an airplane that belongs to you, and this product is stealing IP protected information, for instance, from the airplane, and is sending this to a third jurisdiction, that is forbidden by the Data Act. But that has nothing to do with the specifications, with the technical characteristics of the product. I don't know whether that solves your question, but I think it's important to differentiate what are product characteristics. These are subject to the TBT agreement. And what is not about product characteristics is what a company can do with the data that they own or that they generate. And in both areas, the Union will not adopt and has not adopted any protectionist objective.
Thank you. And thank you, Hitor. Maybe I'll pass to the chair to ask a question.
Thank you very much. And thanks for extremely interesting and educative conversation. So I have a question on regulation. So how could the global level catch up as regulation is happening at national and regional level, or is it completely utopistic to think that these issues could be agreed upon at a global level? And in any case, the cooperation between the different organizations is very important, clearly. Thank you.
Not seeing any hands up to tackle that one online from the panel. Heidi?
Thank you. It's a really important question. And I think that, I mean, the basis of it all is knowledge, education, getting everybody on the same line. I mean, everything is happening so quickly. It's really difficult to follow all the trends. We have many good international forums, including the TBT committee, where we have the possibility to discuss and reflect over these issues. So I'm still hopeful, and we have a lot of competence in all the areas that are related to technical regulation and under the TBT chapeau. So I think that by joining our efforts together, increasing the knowledge, we can come quite far.
Thank you, Heidi. Rebecca?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. And I think like there's a distinction to make between like the things that should be addressed domestically and like the things that can be addressed internationally. So I think whereas like, of course, like domestic approaches to AI regulation will depend on like the very specific like context of the country, the kind of like values, again, that are embedded in like their like cultural background, like what they are trying to achieve might differ like across different countries. I think it's important to identify what are the building blocks of regulatory approaches that can be found like in common and can serve as the basis for international agreement and guidelines, for example. So I discussed before like that we might see like divergence in approaches in terms of like, for example, taking a horizontal approach versus a sector-based approach that again will also depend on like the specific economic system that different countries have in their very specific region. But there are common building blocks, which will be like sharing things like principles, for example, in terms of like what are the key objectives that we're trying to regulate for. Could be things like the human-centric values, and I made the example before of like the OECD principles, for example, be reflected in the UK approach, but also across other regulatory approaches that we already see emerging. And then there's the additional side, which is also like there could be commonalities in the implementation of like these different regulatory approaches. So again, there's I think like opportunities for us to like collaborate on tools for trustworthy AI, for example, as like a tool to implement these principles, and that can have like common approaches such as the use of like international technical standards, for example, adherence and like specific techniques. For assurance, it could also be like agreeing on like a list, for example, of AI risks that countries need to be prioritizing in order to like move measures at a domestic level, but also the international level in order to address that. So I think there are definitely opportunities for something to happen internationally. And I think recent developments in technologies such as generative AI, general purpose AI, and the expanding focus on like future risks as well that are at the frontier of this technology represent common challenges that independently of the regulatory approach that has been taken by different countries are overarching and are like common challenges for like every single partner. So I think there are opportunities there to have internationally agreed on like guidelines, for example, and safety measures to agree on those. And that is also because one of the additional complications that like these technologies also offer is that of course they have a very complex value chain. So you can't necessarily control where the actors across the value chain of AI will be based. You have like, of course, like systems that, for example, are integrated but are being like provided and built in a country, for example, integrated in a product that then is then offered in a different country. So because of all these issues, that is where international collaboration and agreed on guidelines are really needed. So I think there are opportunities, especially for like common challenges that we're all facing, but we might also like need to understand that at the domestic level, because of this particular context of a country and the regulatory environment and ecosystem, domestic approaches might diverge, but that doesn't mean that the general principles and like objectives and how we go about them in implementing them differ as well. So I think that's where the international agreement and collaboration should be looking at. And we're already seeing initiatives happening again in bodies like the G7 or like Tools for Trustworthy Collaboration, for example, OECD, that they're doing some work for the expert groups on international interoperability of AI risk management approaches, for example, and many other bodies. So that's where the focus should be for international collaboration.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Anybody else from the panel who wants to take that? So as promised, I'm going to give the last questions to the panelists. If you'd like to ask any questions, throw your hands up if you're online. Here, I see Haiti up with her hand first, so she gets first to kick it.
Okay, I would like to pose my question to UK and Rebecca. I mean, I was really fascinated hearing about UK vision and principles on AI. Today, I think that we have really got the scope of showing the complexity of it. And I wonder how you have ended up in your current approach and your national strategy. And if you have difficulties in balance, I mean, between these various regulatory boxes or aspects, and for example, how to balance different, let's say, policy concerns, critical infrastructure, cyber in your policy. This is my one question. And the other follow-up is, we have mentioned the role of market surveillance that I think is getting more and more important in related to digital technologies. How have you approached the enforcement of product safety and security and market surveillance in your strategy? Thank you.
So I'll ask you to keep your answer brief, Rebecca, even though that's a very big question.
Yes, very long question. Thank you very much, Heidi. That's a really good question. And again, I'll try to be as brief as possible. So just to quickly speak about the process behind the development of our approach. It's been a long process that like has spanned across 3 years, I think, recently. So it started with the development of the national AI strategy, where we identified what were the key actions, for example, that we needed to follow to like remain a global superpower in science and technology. One of the pillars, as I mentioned in the presentation, was on governing AI effectively, but we also focus on making sure, for example, that we invest in the AI ecosystem, and that includes skills, for example, and ensuring that the benefits of AI are enjoyed across the economy as well. So investing in like sectors as well for the application of AI, sectors that are usually sometimes like not really targeted as like potential sectors for growth, such as agriculture, etc. So we had like a very big agenda of investments that have been made across these areas. But for regulation itself, it's been a very collaborative approach since the beginning. So what we did was to make sure that we had a process in place to speak to a wide range of stakeholders, again, across industry, like civil society, and very closely working with our regulators. So we started by doing an analysis, for example, of the existing regulatory landscape in the UK, understand what the particular areas of expertise and remits of specific regulators were, where existing regulation was enough, for example, and where we needed to be complemented by something else in order to address AI risks effectively. And that is because, again, we need to like take into consideration that it's not moving in a vacuum, AI regulation. There are already like, and it's been mentioned before in this discussion, there are already like very strong legislative frameworks, for example, that address specific aspects of it. So we have data protection frameworks, for example, in the UK and the EU. We have an online safety bill, and like all of these like already deal with like specific harms, if you want, or like risks of AI. But what we saw the need for was this overarching framework to set the expectations of what responsible AI development and deployment looked like in the UK. And that is why we decided on the principles-based approach. We published the policy paper, which had the initial like emerging approach in terms of like setting out our principles, for example, and the need to work with individual regulators back in July. And then we also published that together with a call for public views. So again, through stakeholder engagements, we refined these proposals that then resulted in the specific proposals that we had in the white paper back in March 2023. And that, for example, informed our decision to also have some sort of like central coordination for the central functions that has then been implemented in the framework. And we will continue with this collaborative process. So again, we wanted to have something that is very flexible and can iterate as the technology develops, and also is very rooted in the existing expertise that we have in our UK regulatory system. So again, these principles will be implemented and complement existing law and regulation, for example, using the sector-specific regulators' expertise. I think there was a specific question also on market surveillance. So again, we are leaving it to like specific regulators across different sectors to define, for example, what the principles will look like in the remit and what practical measures stakeholders across industry, for example, will need to take to comply to them. So to give you an example, you asked about safety, for example, product safety. We have OPSS, which is our Office for Product Safety and Standards, is the regulator overseeing product safety in the UK. So they're going to be doing a review of what AI and machine learning, for example, means in the remit, what additional measures might be needed in addition to existing regulations to deal with these risks. And similarly, we have, for example, regulators like the MHRA, who oversee medical devices and how AI goes into that. And all these regulators across sectors are already like starting engagements and projects to basically review what the implications of new emerging technologies such as generative AI are for their sectors and what else is needed. So in just summarize very shortly, like collaboration and then reliance of existing framework and identifying gaps and filling those through the implementation of the principles. But I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Last question to Jason.
Sure, thank you. So there are ideas out there. We're going to take AI just for a second and say many people are raising examples of AI where they can raise a question of when is it unethical not to deliver an AI solution, such as in healthcare or places where people don't have access to physicians, that there might be opportunities that AI brings to the market that are very different. And hearing from Humera's comments earlier and examples that I provided where it's really about opportunities from technology to create new business models or new opportunity in many different ways. So my question to the panel members really is, in speaking of standards, I've heard you refer to standards as a mechanism for technical regulation. But there's a fundamental other side to the conversation about standards as a voluntary market-led system designed to promote opportunity. So I'm curious from the panel, how do you differentiate between the role of standards for that voluntary market-led opportunity side as opposed to standards as a function of technical regulation?
Show of hands online, or someone want to take that on, or here?
Jason, I'll start. I can start. Some very with my thoughts around it, at least, is I think before we go down the path of regulations, I think first comes the guiding principles of any business. And I think this is really where we're losing sight. And even though AI is providing a lot of opportunity, we would need to apply the basic business principles to it first. It doesn't need regulators first. I think it needs the basic business principles first of where it's used, how secure is it, how safe it is for everybody to use. And then comes the specific things that we need to apply around AI is that it's not including any biases, that it's not actually causing any harm. Those are the second level of, I think, business ethics that need to be applied. I think those are some kind of, we don't need to be alarmed by a lot of AI at this point. I think we need to just calm down a little bit and start looking at what are the basic business principles, you know, the different ISO certifications, everything that is required around any of the business and technologies, those need to be applied. And I think then the regulators in this case also need to take a different look at it, because just this morning, a big news about one of the top techs from tech guys saying, let's remove the regulators from this cycle and let the tech guys drive the regulations for AI because the regulators don't understand it. I think any of the extremes won't work. I think regulations, working with the tech, working with the industry, is what regulation around AI specifically should be, because we're dealing with something which is innovative, because we're dealing with something we don't know what are the boundaries around it. I think that's really where regulations need to come. But we need to look at a different look at it, is not go to the extreme and let tech drive it, not go to the extremes and let regulators drive it. I think we need to find a common ground. This is really what I as a tech person, I think about, how do we put all of the regulations together in one place and then start driving, okay, the things that Rebecca was talking about, start applying the different layers to it. And then you start driving, okay, these are the basic building blocks. Then these are the specific around, you know, like the ethical part, the bias part, all of those. And then comes around a specific industry, then comes around specific regions. I think we need to start, that's how I would look at it, is basic business principles and then taking it applying different layers to it from an AI perspective. Because if one person leads this, the tech leads it or regulators lead it, it would be very hard to implement it.
I think you're landing us in a collaboration point, and I'd venture to add civil society in there as well. Maybe a little controversial, but I think it's worth sort of adding that dynamic. And maybe I don't see any other hands up. So I'm going to take this opportunity to close the session and release everybody to lunch, so that you will continue to like me and Canada more generally, because we are very nice. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers, those who came here in person and those who joined us at very odd hours of the day from far away, both for your presentations, your insights, your questions, really wonderful and quite in-depth discussion. I'd like to thank our participants for the insightful presentations, thought-provoking questions, and interventions. In my capacity as a moderator, I will be providing a brief report outlining a few personal conclusions on the session during the regular meeting in the TBT committee under the agenda item on regulatory cooperation. And as well, there'll be a longer moderator's report, which will be circulated in a few weeks. Last, but certainly not least, I'd also like to thank the TBT team and secretariat, who, quite frankly, without this, I would have been lost, being, as Madonna said, a WTO TBT virgin here. And I'd also like to very much thank our interpreters for their hard work and keeping up with some of us who spoke fast. So thank you so much. I do encourage everyone to join my colleague from Singapore, Wei, who will be moderating the next thematic session focusing on cybersecurity. That will start at 1500 Geneva time. This will be an important opportunity to have more focused discussion on regulatory measures that address cybersecurity, a key subset of the regulatory actions we've been discussing in this session. And one last plug, Eddie has been kind enough to leave some copies of her of the National Board of Trade's report out in the hallway. If you'd like a hard copy, I know that you could leave your email address and she would follow up with you. And with that, thank you very much. I conclude this thematic session with 3 minutes to spare. Thank you very much.